Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. I have been here twice before, but never on a Sunday morning. So this is fun for me to see your faces, and I know that you're delighted to see my face, and especially because I just got an incredible revelation of something I can call myself. Because I knew I couldn't call myself young. I mean, I knew I'd passed that. But I hated to call myself old, right? But today I found out I could call myself young at heart. Da-da-da! I am liberated. And you may not feel liberated, but just join me in my liberation. I am young again. Hallelujah. It's funny, I'm going to be talking to you today about time, and the one thing that happens when you cease to be young before you become young at heart, you become aware that time only goes in one direction, right? And some mornings you get up and look in the mirror and you say, you're working against me, right? But this morning I feel wonderful. I also heard this phrase, you put it up there, faith leaves footprints in the sands of time. And I thought, well, how fitting, because I'm going to be talking to you about time. And one of the reasons that I'm going to be speaking that to you, is because of something that this house did for me, and most of you don't even know about it, so I'm going to take just a second to tell you, if I may. I'm friends with a man named James Nesbitt. How many of you know who that is in the house? Some of you do. He's been friends of your apostle, co-laborers with your apostles, labored hard in the state of Illinois for a number of years, and actually was born again in our assembly, in our church, and then loosed from our assembly to be a prayer coordinator, first for the state of Illinois and now actually for nations. So a year ago in July, James and I did what we called a plumb line tour. This was actually James's idea. Thankfully, I was young at heart and able to keep up with him. But we started in the lower part of the state in Cairo, and we came up all the way to Zion and zigzagged our way kind of across the state in 12 days, 12 consecutive days. But the thing that made it even a little bit more interesting is we did 2 meetings every day. So we did 24 meetings in 12 consecutive days as we zigzagged our way up through the state. And we would come to a place and he'd set up his musicians. James is the kind of guy who likes to release a sound and believes that in that unseen realm, the sound is restructuring the atmosphere. How many of you know when God created the world, go to that 7-day creation, he created the heavens before he created the earth, right? Day 2 was the heavens, day 3 was the earth. So there's something about paying attention first to your spiritual life, come on, right? Before you pay attention to your natural life too. So James restructures the heaven through worship. So he would set up the band and he would restructure, and then he wanted me to deliver a word based on what they had been singing. But the only problem, if I could say it that way, is we never knew what they were going to be singing until they started singing it. So I'd be sitting on the front row going, God, I need a word like right now that goes with whatever it is they're doing. And so 24 messages, I couldn't come prepped for anything. I had no prep except for what was in here and tuning my ear. But we got to this house, and God began speaking to me about what he termed as a timed gate. And I began to loose in this house a message that I'm going to give you today that has been developed. It was prophetically delivered here about how important it is that we appear at a certain time window and believe that that time window is accomplishing eternal things. So I got the seed of what you're going to hear now, and you're only going to get a smidgen of it. I've got more material in my table on it. That what God dropped in my heart here, I've been developing. So I love you for so many reasons. I love you because I can be young again, and I love you for the message that was delivered, and I love you for your years of faithfulness. My husband and I, if we were still pastoring, this year would be our 40th year in the pastoral ministry. I know. Our son is now our pastor. So it's the church is still there. But for 40 years, we have heard about Apostle Don Lyons and the work in up here in Rockford. And my heart was attached to you before we ever had a chance to get up here. And so now it's wonderful for me to see you on this Sunday morning. All right, well, if I can then, I'm going to talk to you about being a guardian of eternal precepts, eternal principles, or eternity as you walk through your timeline, as you go through the time frame of your earth. So guardians of eternity in time. And I'd like for you to turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 16. And Matthew chapter 16 is a passage you're probably going to be familiar with. It's that place where Jesus said he was going to build his church. And this word church in the Greek, how many of you can stand a little Greek on a Sunday morning? All right, well, good. This word church is ekklesia. And you probably have heard that, but it's kind of a current buzzword in the Christian community. A lot of people are preaching on the ekklesia. I actually have got to get in on the buzz, so I have a book at the back table on ekklesia. But ekklesia is what was translated church. It comes from a Greek word kaleo, meaning called, and ek means the prefix is out. So if you literally translate it, it'd be, I'm going to build my called out. So Jesus is speaking that there in Matthew 16, and he says to them in verse 13, I'm going to begin reading in verse 13. When Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Well, some say that you're John the Baptist, and some say you're Elijah, and others say you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said unto them, "But whom do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, before I actually talk about his proclamation of saying he'd build his church, let's just focus in on those couple of verses just for a second. So Jesus is saying, "Who do you think I am?" And I'd like you to pay attention to the names that they brought forth. If I could say it this way, they went back in the history or in the timeline of God's dealings with the nation of Israel, with their religious timeline, with the prophets from the Old Testament, and they began to recount people in this past timeline. This is going to be my timeline today, okay? It's going to be past, it's going to be future. I'm going to walk back and forth just so you know what I'm doing. I'm in the past right now. So they backed up into the past and they began to say, "Oh, well, this guy and that guy." And so they're recalling history. And then Peter gets this kind of inspiration, and we know it's an inspiration because Jesus later says, "Flesh and blood didn't reveal it to you, but my Father." It's like Peter is able to think his way through prophecies and moves of God and things that laid historical framework to bring them to this day. And he goes, I know, like you're in school back when you were really young and you were in school and the teacher would ask and you had the answer and you'd raise your hand, call on me. And when you didn't have it, you looked down, and that's the time they called on you, right? When you were, but somebody got me, I got it. That's what Peter was doing. I know. And it's like Peter put the prophecies and put the word of the Lord and put the promises and put the back history. He tied it all together. He strung the historical frame references together until he said, I know where we are in our current time frame. You're the promised Christ, and you're here in the fullness of time. God sent forth his Son. He said, I know what's happening in this window of time. How many think it's important that we would be aware of the times and seasons? In our own personal life and what God is doing in the kingdom, we should know what's going on, right? So Peter was able to put the pieces of the past together to come with a right answer for that moment. And so Jesus responds to him, Peter, you have received that from my Father. That's what verse 17 says. And then verse 18, Jesus goes on to say, and I will say also unto you, that you are Peter, and upon this rock you're a little stone, but upon this major rock of revelation, the rock of who Jesus is, Jesus said, I'm going to build my church. How many of you know he's the cornerstone, the sure foundation, the rock upon which the church is built? He says, I'm going to build my ecclesia. Out kaleo call. I'm going to build my ecclesia. Everybody say ecclesia. I'm going to build my ecclesia. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I'm going to give to this ecclesia, I'm going to give to you keys of the kingdom of heaven, so that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, Jesus said, I'm going to build my ecclesia. Here's a little sideline for you to think about. Jesus said he's going to build his church. How many think that's probably important? Right. Do you think Jesus' church is important in the history of humanity? Well, interestingly enough, Jesus only talks about the church 2 times in all of your 4 Gospels that have all the red letters and everything. Only twice does Jesus talk about the church. And only here and 2 chapters later in Matthew 18, he uses the word church. And then after that, he doesn't mention it anymore. So it doesn't sound very important to him if we think it's important because of the number of usages. So we know he taught on the kingdom, that he demonstrated the kingdom. He came to live as the king. He died to pay for our sins, but he was raised, ascended to heaven to get a throne, to be a king. He's king of all the earth. How many know a lot of stuff about Jesus is about king and kingdom? But as far as church, everybody say not much. All right, so either it's not important and we made a big deal, or the context in which he said it was pregnant with meaning. Now, for us to understand the context, may I suggest to you, if he had them rehearse history so that they would know who he was, do you think that he also expected them to rehearse history to know what it meant when he said, I'm going to build my called out? I want to suggest to you when he said, I'm going to build my called out, it was in the context of 4,000 years of history of called out people administrating the kingdom on the earth. Jesus said, I'm going to give you keys. You're going to be kingdom administrators. You're going to be kingdom legislators. So they would have said, oh, kingdom legislators, I know people that did that. Oh, keys of kingdom management, I know where that came from. Oh, called out, I have a history. And so throughout the backstory, lots of called out covenant people called to serve God in their generation. And especially when you look at Moses and the nation of Israel, from which these disciples were all in that seed line, right, in that history line, they knew what a called out nation was because they were part of Israel. And Israel had been called out of Egypt and called into a promised land, come on, and given keys of kingdom management so they would go into the promised land and manage the promised land for the kingdom of God. So when Jesus said, I'm going to build my ecclesia, my called out, all the whistles and bells should have gone off. We know, we get it, we know what this is about, we know what's going to happen to us. So at that timeline, Jesus was collecting the history, moving it through that window, that now moment in history, to launch them into their future on the course that he was setting out before them. It was important that they walked from yesterday through this gate today into their future in order to build the kingdom. How many of you say, I think that might be right? Wow, it is. And do you know he does that? This is God's pattern to use time to accomplish his purposes. I wanted to just talk to you about that, but if you'll give me the liberty, and because I'm preaching, I get to take all these amazing liberties really without your permission. I'm going to just switch a couple of words here. Jesus said, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In other words, he's saying, line up heaven and earth. Right? Bring them into harmony and line them up. Now, could I say to you that earth is the realm of time? Would that be right? And heaven is the realm of eternal. So another thing that Jesus was saying to him, I want you to make sure that eternity and time come into proper alignment. I want you to make sure that this time meets eternal purposes. How many think that's what Jesus came in the fullness of time? Was that eternal will? God was lining up eternity and time in that gate, in that window, to accomplish his kingdom purposes. So this is the revelation that I got when I was here a year ago, that time is the tool that God uses to bring eternity into the earth. I got to say that to you again. I'm going to talk to you about it the rest of the time I'm here. Time is the tool that God himself uses to bring eternity into the earth. Now that kind of blew my mind when I thought about it, because, God is just God, and he could just go eternity, boom. Why does God need time? He doesn't need time, except apparently he chose to use time. And let me just back you up to the way God created everything in the beginning, if I may. We know, all the way back here, that God was going to make heaven and the earth. The scripture says. And so he makes heaven. We're not told how he did that, how many days that took. We do see in other places in the scripture it's a pretty awesome place, right? So he makes heaven, and then he begins to, which is the eternal realm, makes that eternal realm. And now he's going to make the earth. And so he comes day by day by day by day. Why couldn't God just say be? You understand, it did not take God 6 days to make creation, or he did not need it, let me say it that way. He did not need 6 billion years, like evolution would try to tell us, or science would try to. God did not need time, because he's all-knowing, all-wise, all-powerful. If he had done it in a split second, it still would have been as perfect as if he had taken time. But he took time because he was communicating to mankind how our efforts would be. He was laying out a pattern for us to follow. So day 1, light dawns. Day 2, God creates a firmament. Day 3, the earth comes forth. You know how it goes day after day? And at the end of every day, God said, that's good. Now, I would like to suggest to you, you and I, looking through the process of building something, we hardly think it's good until we're done. And if you look at day 2 and everything just a watery mess, right? You can't hardly look at that and say, now that's good looking. We'd say, well, that's so far from finished, how can that be good? May I suggest to you that what God, at least in part, what God was saying, that's all I intended to do today. And I did it exactly like I wanted. I completed that timed window, got to the end of my determined will, and sat down and said, that's good for that time frame. And day by day by day, he let the past stay intact so that he could build the next day based on what he had built before. And every day he added to the next window of time throughout history, throughout those 7 days of history, until he got to it is completed. And when he finished, he had made heaven on the earth. When he finished, this was heaven on the earth. This was so much heaven on the earth. Say, how much heaven was it? I'm so glad you asked. God decided to move in. He made his throne in Eden. He had a throne in heaven. His footstool was in the earth. Heaven and earth were in total harmony. When Jesus said, pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, he wasn't coming up with a slogan. Like, hey, boys, let's come up with something that they'll still be saying 4,000 years from now. It wasn't that. He was saying, this is the purpose of God, that heaven comes to earth. Did you ever read the end of the book, when heaven comes to the earth? Yeah, that's it. That's the purpose, right? So day by day by day, God created a little bit more of the reflection of the eternal realm into the time realm. So when he got to the end of time, eternal will was accomplished in this realm. And God moved into the creation that he had made. Let me say it to you this way. God could have done it instantly, but he didn't. Each day he used to fulfill his eternal decree. So therefore, time should move towards eternity. What is the purpose of time? To move us toward eternity. Time should apprehend eternal plans. So therefore, time is the servant of eternity. So on that day, Jesus said, this moment, this time serves that eternal timeline, and in this moment, eternal will is done. Now, was that the end of everything? Wasn't the end of everything, because we're still here, and we're still taking the keys, and we're still, moving through era after era and generation after generation to press this timeline called His story to His eternal, it is good and it is finished. Somebody said, I think this might be right. This is right. So I left here that plumb line tour. I forget what night we were here, but whatever night I left here, and I just could not put that down. Time serves eternity. I always kind of felt like time was an enemy. Anybody ever felt like that? I don't have enough time. Or when you're hurting, time goes too slow. When you're happy, time goes too fast. When you've got a job to do, you never have enough time. Did you ever take time out of its eternal purpose and pull it into a carnal temporal reasoning and then war with time? Anybody beside me ever do that? And I left here going, time serves eternity, and kept thinking about that. And so my mind went to this passage that you all are familiar with. I always say this is my go-to passage when I don't know what God is doing. This is the one I quote. I bet you do the same thing. He works all things together for good. Anybody quote that? Yeah, hello. All right, let's look at that for a second. And so I'm going to Romans 8. I'm going to have a little more Greek this morning. We know that there's a synergy of all things. All things work together for good. To those who love God and who are called, kaleo. Anybody heard that word before? Ecclesia, this is that word. Those that are called, according to His purpose. This word purpose is Greek prothesis. You know what a thesis is? Anybody ever had to write a thesis? On my studying for my doctoral, I wrote so many theses. I began to hate it when they told me I had to write another one, right? So a prothesis means knowing what you're going to say before you set your pen to it. The prothesis. And those then that He did foreknow, He did predestinate. Now say the word predestination. And then smile and wave. Nobody wants to talk about this word, right? Those whom He did foreknow, He did predestinate to be conformed to the image of the Son, that He might be the firstborn of many brethren. Moreover, those whom He did predestinate, He also called. Here's our word. Those whom He called, He justified. Those whom He justified, He glorified. Let's just break that down very quickly for you here by looking at the word predestination. The word predestination comes from the Greek word proorizo, and it is the word where we would get, if I wrote it here, you could see the word horizon. And so it means to set in advance where you're going. You know ahead of time your horizon. Do you know how I got to Rockford yesterday? I set a GPS. And I didn't tell it how to take me here. I just told it where I was going. Didn't we, Pastor? We plugged it in. Our little phone talks to the big screen. It puts a map up there. It tells us go right, go left, gives us a direction. But it didn't tell us where we were going. We told it where we were going. I use my sovereignty to set my predestined end. Is anybody freaked yet? How many of you think it's a good thing God knew where He was going? How many of you think when God said on day one, when I get done with this journey of time, this is where I'm going to end up? You know where He was going to end up? An earth that reflected heaven. An earth that was filled with glory. He moved through time to create eternal will. So when He got to His horizon, now this says, you've been predestined. You better be glad, because you've been predestined to be conformed to the image. That means you're born again so you could be a son. That God's plan always for us was to go become an image bearer. to be created and recreated to bear the image of the Son. So God said, all the way down here, he said, when this thing is done and day 6 gets here, I'm going to make me a man. And he said, he pulled out the dirt, and he said, let us make man after our image. When did he say that? Because he had made a plan to have predestined man. By the time he gets to the dirt, let us put them onto their GPS course to hit the horizon. And part of creating man in the image was to get us to Jesus so we could be forgiven and we could be redeemed and we could be, born again, right? So that predestined plan could be brought about. We've been predestined. I remember a few years ago, this has been quite a few years ago now, my mom, some of you may have heard me tell this story, but my mom decided that she was young at heart. And, get it? I said, my mom decided she was young at heart. You following me? Okay. And as being young at heart, she thought she didn't want to do turkey Thanksgiving dinner anymore. That should go to the young. So she decided my sister and me should take over Thanksgiving dinner, and she would just come and eat instead of doing all the work for us to come and eat. So my sister, being the oldest, took her elder firstborn authority and said, Patti, it's yours. You get to do it. So I was appointed to have Thanksgiving dinner, and so I had to do all the planning that I never had to think about, and I came up with this amazing revelation of predestination. And this was the revelation, that as soon as I got the commission, I could think myself all the way down to Thanksgiving dinner. And then I could just start. You know what you do after you think? You hit the button called start on time. And so day 1, okay, day 2, get on the phone. Karen, you get the hardest dish of all of Mom, since you're not going to do it. You get to make the dressing. Got back at her. Anyway, throughout the windows of time, I moved from knowing I had to do it, hitting the start button, I moved through time towards Thanksgiving, toward the proorizo, toward the predestined plan. And as time went by, I knew when it was time to buy the turkey. I know you're going to think that this isn't a woman so wise you don't even know how to comprehend my wisdom. But I'll give you a little hint how I knew. The flyer for the grocery store came out and said I could buy turkey at 29 cents a pound. That was my sign from heaven to advance. And I went and bought a frozen turkey. And I came home with a 24-pound frozen turkey. And I knew, I'm telling you, I knew what to do with it. I threw it in the freezer. And more days passed. And now getting closer to my end. And I took that bird out of the freezer and I put it in a water bath. So it began to, come on, ladies, you know what I'm talking about. Men, pay no attention to us. You're just starting to salivate. I know. But I knew what time it was to thaw it. I knew what time it was to throw it in the oven. I knew what time it was to take it out. I knew how to hit each one of those time events in order to get to my proorizo. God knew what events to hit throughout history to move his story forward so that at the end of time, he would have sons created in his image, managing the earth for his glory. Come on. But if we think back to the garden, we know what did occur. God created everything and then he entrusted it to Adam. And Adam should have every day, because he was supposed to kind of make the earth fruitful and multiply and fill it up. Remember that? In other words, make more stuff of what you got. Adam, you got raw materials. What are you going to do with it? So Adam could have hung around with God, gotten the purpose and plan of heaven, and then begun to take those raw materials and create a little more heaven on the earth. So that at the end of his day, after he had done his labors, God could have come back and said, that's good. And Adam and Adam's sons, had the fall not occurred, would have taken the earth from one level of maturation or glorification to another level of maturation and glorification. Come on. Until the glory of God that started in Eden covered the earth as the waters covered the sea. That was man's commission. But we know that the serpent entered. And may I suggest to you that kind of the serpent said, you ought to get your information from this realm, not that realm. What do you see? Don't you think you'd like to eat that, Eve? Doesn't that appeal to you? Wouldn't you like to have promotion now rather than later? Began to talk to her about receiving her patterns of building from this realm. And when she did, instead of aligning time with eternity, she aligned time with a fallen being and a fallen concept and a fallen world. Did she not? She failed in that commission. And earth got out of harmony. Time got out of harmony with eternity. Earth got out of harmony. And mankind got out of right relationship with God. So what did God do? He began using time. How did he create it to begin? By using time. How's he going to fix it? He starts using time. And throughout time, God begins to look for men that he can call to get into the timeline. So therefore, Matthew 16, they go, ooh, Jeremiah was in the timeline, and Isaiah was in the timeline, and how many know David was in the timeline? And each one of those men, Abraham, Moses, they gathered what God wanted done in their day. Abraham didn't do everything for forever. He did what needed to be done in his day. So that at the end of Abraham's day, God could go, well, that's good. Resetting the timeline with redemptive purposes. Come on, Moses. You're my called out. I'm going to call out a nation. Come on, called out nation. Get the law. Come on, called out nation with the law that has the keys. Go into Canaan and begin to reset that land after eternal purposes, and generation after generation, and a people group after people group. Excuse me. We're called by God to get heaven's will, release it into their time frame until it came up to Jesus' day, when he was going to commission his church. We are today part of that ongoing company of people. You know, we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Hebrews says. You know what they're saying? I walked through my time window. You guys walked through your time window. We did what we were supposed to do, but they, without us, are not complete. Why? Because they could only run their part of the timeline. But then they need those who's going to take the timeline on and on and on until it is finished. Then everybody that built in that timeline will have finished their race, along with those that are alive finishing the race. Right? We are called to steward eternity's will in our timeline. You are called to steward eternity's will in your timeline. I'm just going to tell you, these last couple minutes, I'm going to tell you a couple of operations that are necessary for the church as a whole, that are necessary for you and me to line up our life. How many of you think before you got saved, you were doing a lot of wandering on your timeline? And God's redemption put you on a straight and narrow path, right? So one of the things that is important for you is know your season. There's a season for everything. I could not give a birth to my babies. I had 5. You know why I had 5? Because I didn't want to have 6. Sorry, that was just a little humor in the midst here. At 3 months wasn't the time. By 5 months, I was pretty sure it was time. By 7 months, you couldn't have paid me enough money to change my mind. It was time. But not until the time arose, right? So it's good to know your timeline. That's something you can ask God, where am I? What season am I in? You cannot prosper living in tomorrow's season today. You cannot prosper living in yesterday's season today. You have to know your season. The other thing you have to do is you have to remember what went before you. So remember, the nation of Israel would celebrate Passover every year. Remember that? And so once it was started, God said to Moses, now every year on the 15th day of this first month, remember and celebrate. Now he wasn't saying to Israel, oh man, you ought to just think about it. Boy, those were good old days. Remember that? You know how we say that? Remember that? He wasn't talking about remember as in rehearse knowledge. He was saying get the grace and the power that was activated in that Passover season and make sure that's here in your timeline. This morning we celebrated communion where we remember the Lord's death till he comes. We're not supposed to just think about him hanging on Calvary and some picture we saw, the Passion of the Christ or whatever. We're supposed to get the power of yesterday and activate that in our timeline, because day after day after day is built on what went before. Come on. What has God done for you in days gone by? What graces has he released? What word has he released? What things did he put in your past that you need as tools for this present day? Remember those. And then forget. Paul said, forgetting those things that are behind, I press. What are you supposed to forget? Forget the things that are not profitable to this timeline. Everybody has junk in the past. Everybody has pain. Everybody has misfortunes. And when we allow our emotions to be tied to yesterday, we anchor ourselves in our yesterday. Do you know what unforgiveness is? Anchoring your soul to yesterday while we stand today praying for tomorrow. Man, that alone would probably preach, wouldn't it? I will say it again if I can remember what I said. We take another run at this. Maybe not right. I don't know. When we hold unforgiveness, when we hold bitterness, when we allow yesterday to still kink up our soul, we anchor ourselves in yesterday. We tie ourselves to a past timeline. Whereas we stand in today's timeline praying for something to happen today and for God to do something for us tomorrow, all the while we're holding ourselves back here wondering what's going on. Some things leave behind. And however long it takes you to get it reconciled, would you get it reconciled so you can appear at this time gate? You can know your season. You can bring the power of yesterday into here. And like Jesus did with his disciples, he said, let's collect. Let's shift you, let's turn you, and let's commission you into your destiny. That's what will happen in your time gates. You will be commissioned into your tomorrow. Everybody that wants to be commissioned into tomorrow, just go ahead and raise your hand and say, for me too, Lord. And I believe that in Jesus' name. I'm going to ask Pastor to come as he finishes out the service for us.